The old school washroom had always given Emily the creeps. It was a small, dingy room at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows on the cracked, yellowing tiles, and the air was always thick with a damp, moldy smell. Stories about the washroom were whispered among the students, tales of ghostly apparitions and inexplicable occurrences. But Emily had always dismissed them as silly superstitions, until that fateful evening. Emily had stayed late after school to finish a project, and by the time she was ready to leave, the building was nearly deserted. She hurried down the hallway, her footsteps echoing off the walls, when she felt a sudden, pressing need to use the restroom. Reluctantly, she made her way to the washroom. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, it creaked ominously, sending a shiver down her spine. She stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind her with a resounding thud. The washroom was colder than the rest of the school, and Emily wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake off the chill. She chose the farthest stall, its door hanging slightly ajar, and locked herself inside. As she sat there, she became acutely aware of the oppressive silence. The usual hum of distant voices and footsteps was absent, replaced by an unnerving stillness. Suddenly, Emily heard a faint dripping sound. Drip, drip, drip. She glanced down and saw water pooling around her feet. Panic began to rise within her as she realized the source of the sound was not a leaking pipe but something far more sinister. The water was dark, almost black, and had a thick, oily consistency. It spread rapidly, soaking into her shoes and sending a cold, numbing sensation up her legs. Emily tried to open the stall door, but it was stuck. She pushed harder, her heart pounding in her chest, but it refused to budge. The dripping sound grew louder, more insistent, and she could hear it coming from the stall next to hers as well. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she pounded on the door, desperate to escape. Then she heard it, a low, guttural moan coming from the stall beside hers. Emily froze, her blood turning to ice. The moan was followed by a series of wet, squelching sounds, as if something was crawling through the thick liquid on the floor. She could feel its presence, something dark and malevolent, just beyond the thin partition. Summoning every ounce of courage, Emily slammed her shoulder against the door. It gave way with a loud crack, and she stumbled out into the washroom. The room was darker now, the flickering lights barely illuminating the space. She glanced around frantically, her eyes wide with terror. The stalls seemed to stretch endlessly, their doors ajar, revealing glimpses of shadowy figures moving inside. Emily ran to the sink, her hands shaking as she turned on the tap. Cold water splashed over her fingers, but it did nothing to wash away the grime and fear clinging to her. In the mirror above the sink, she saw her own reflection, pale and frightened. But then, behind her, she saw something else, a dark figure, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow, staring at her from the shadows. She spun around, but the figure was gone. The washroom was silent once more, save for the relentless dripping. Emily backed away from the sink, her eyes darting around the room. She knew she had to get out, but the door seemed impossibly far away. Taking a deep breath, she bolted for the exit, her footsteps echoing loudly. As she reached the door, it swung open violently, knocking her to the ground. She looked up, expecting to see a teacher or a janitor, but instead, she saw nothing but darkness. The corridor outside was pitch black, and the cold air that rushed and carried a foul, decaying smell. Emily scrambled to her feet and ran into the hallway, the darkness swallowing her up. She ran blindly, her heart pounding in her ears, until she collided with something solid. She stumbled back, her hands reaching out to steady herself, and found she had run into a wall. Confused, she turned around, only to realize she was back in the washroom. The door was gone, replaced by a solid, featureless wall. The washroom seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing closer. The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened, twisting into grotesque shapes. Emily felt a presence behind her, something breathing down her neck. She turned slowly, her body trembling with fear, and saw the dark figure standing just inches away. Its face was a grotesque mask of decay, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. It reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers curling around her throat. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure leaned in closer, its breath hot and rancid on her face. She felt herself being pulled into the darkness, her vision dimming, her strength fading. Just as she was about to succumb, she heard a distant voice calling her name. It was faint, but it gave her a glimmer of hope. She fought against the darkness, reaching out towards the voice. The grip on her throat loosened, and the figure began to fade. With a final, desperate effort, Emily broke free and stumbled towards the sound. She found herself back in the corridor, the lights flickering back to life. She turned to see the washroom door standing open behind her, but the dark figure was gone. Emily took a deep breath, her heart still racing, and ran towards the exit. She burst out of the school, gasping for air, and collapsed on the steps. The next day, Emily told her friends what had happened, but few believed her. The washroom was just an ordinary, albeit creepy, place to them. But Emily knew the truth. She had seen the darkness that lurked within its walls, and she knew she would never set foot in that washroom again. The stories, she realized, were not just tales to scare children, they were warnings. And she had barely escaped with her life.